Good morning. I would like to welcome you to the symposium, and I think it's time to start now. I'd like to thank Amber Zambelli more than anyone else here today for putting together this wonderful symposium. If any of you were here last night, the event went off to a beautiful, smooth start. And so I also want to thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for their incredible support for this topic. So this is a very timely symposium. I think it's actually one which is overdue here on the Berkeley campus, and so I'm quite pleased that we are all going to be able to think about the very complex issues which encompass the idea of cultural heritage. What is cultural heritage? Is it tangible, intangible, etc.? Many challenging questions. And oftentimes, when we start to look at these issues, we find they actually can be quite philosophical. When we try to look at what is right, what is wrong, who has the right to say what should be done, etc., these can be very philosophical issues which are very unclearly defined most of the time. I can say there's really no black and white about many of these situations, and occasionally we find that we need to look at one particular situation differently than another. So it's almost as though the context is extremely important, the social context, the political context, the geographical context, etc. So the reason we're here, of course, is to grapple with the whole issue of destruction. What do we do after destruction? How do we respond constructively to destruction? And I think this is an extremely urgent issue that, of course, we need to make the world a little bit more aware of the urgency. As you know, there are many types of destruction. There's the kind of destruction that we are seeing that comes through conflict, war, ideology, and there's also another kind of destruction which comes from looting, or maybe even, as Patty Gerstenblith mentioned last night in her wonderful lecture, expansion in cities, etc. So, but I want to get back to the looting as well for a moment, because looting is something which doesn't just occur as a result of conflict and warfare. It is definitely economically related in many areas. So when there is a depressed economy, perhaps people will turn towards looting in order to make some kind of profit. There are many, many reasons for this kind of looting. There's also the motivation behind it, which is the almost insatiable thirst, one could say, of collecting antiquities. And so there's this cycle which we have to be very aware of and not just focus on things like conflict in terms of destruction or even ideological destruction, but also what we are doing in terms of this idea of protecting heritage through collecting, etc., which I feel is an erroneous way to look at it myself. All in all, we need many different kinds of responses to these different situations. And so that's why we're here today, to entertain many viewpoints and to support that idea of multivocality, which is extremely important. We have specialists in law, specialists in education, archaeology, archaeologists that go work in these countries that are in the field. We have people in technology that are working on ways to preserve, to document, maybe even reinvent heritage. We also have artists, and I would like to take this opportunity to point out that in the atrium we have a beautiful exhibition of artists that have been kind enough to loan their work. Fred Parhad has brought some beautiful, beautiful sculpture. You'll see all of that out in the display. And what is so wonderful about it is these are all positive creative responses to something which is, of course, very tragic and destructive. So I invite you to enjoy that during the breaks and the lunch. So what do we do? What do we do? Big question. How do we protect? How do we document? How do we conserve? How do we recreate? The lost and endangered heritage. Endangered heritage is one thing, lost heritage is another. The wonderful thing is that with technology today, actually a lot of the lost heritage can be recreated through digital means, and we do have Barry Through who will talk about this today from New Palmyra. And so what to do, how to do it. With technology, we are able to scan sites, we're able to crowdsource databases of imagery, make three-dimensional recreations, or even virtual reality recreations out there that are wonderful. And I myself cannot wait to use these in the classroom. I think it's very exciting to be able to present to a student something which is a lot more visceral, if you want to call it that. Being able to feel like you're walking through perhaps the Apadana at Persepolis as opposed to simply looking at it in 2 dimensions in a book. So I think the silver lining with all of this actually is that we've come together to find solutions, and part of that solution is how there's been this amazing jump in technology. And so we can be at least consoled by that aspect. Another big issue is who is going to be doing the work? Who is going to do the protecting, the documenting, the research, conservation? Who's going to reimagine these sites? And this is very crucial. This is also perhaps one of the more controversial aspects because, of course, we want to include in the conversation local inhabitants, local authorities. We want to include specialists, archaeologists. We want to include people on a global scale. And so when we talk about something like world heritage or global heritage, is that really a term we should be using? You know, that's also something to think about. Who has the right to the heritage? I think also one of the more important issues to look at is how do we convey why it is important to document and conserve heritage, ancient sites, history. And I know why because it's my field, it's my profession. You know why because you're here today. But outside of the bounds of this particular auditorium today, I'm not so sure we are very successful at conveying the urgency and the importance of trying to preserve and protect cultural heritage, especially in areas of conflict like the Middle East today. And I'll tell you a little story just to illustrate this. So my husband and I sit down with our daughters to dinner every night, and we discuss all kinds of things, social issues, politics, etc. And they're in high school. They're high school age, and they're very aware kids. They were raised in Berkeley, and so and also with my own, talking about archaeology, the ancient Near East, etc. at the dinner table constantly. They tend to roll their eyes when I broach the subject, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this too. And so last year was a particularly bad year. I'm sure many of you will agree, to be in the field of archaeology or history, especially that dealing with the Middle East, the ancient Near East. And the whole year during my teaching, I did teach a number of courses in Mesopotamian archaeology, Iranian archaeology, cultural heritage, etc. And I was constantly being put in this shattering situation of teaching students about a wonderful site, a wonderful culture, and then maybe the next week dealing with how to tell them, well, this site has been damaged or looted or destroyed. And it was also hard on my students, I have to say. This actually happened once before in 2003 when we invaded Iraq and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted. But the difference is that we hoped and we thought and we knew that a lot of those objects could be recovered, and many were. So the events of 2015 were very different. And I have to say the events since the beginning of the 21st century, really, beginning with the Bamiyan Buddhas being destroyed in 2001. So Anyway, I remember coming home one night. I must have looked even more of a mess than usual. I'd probably been sobbing that day, and I think it probably was the day that the Temple of Bel of Palmyra was destroyed. And so my daughter Sophie, who's 16, she looks at me and she says, "Wow, Mom, you look really bad. You look like somebody died." And I'm thinking, yes, it feels like somebody died. It feels like somebody very close to me has gone, because these sites, to me, were very much alive. I could imagine the artisans, I could imagine the architects, I could imagine the merchants and the people who moved through the space, who created these wonderful places. So yes, it felt like somebody had died. I didn't say this to her, but I did say, well, you know, the Temple of Bel at Palmyra was destroyed, and this is a very tragic event. And so she looked at me, and she said, "Mom, the fish are dying." So what do you respond to a person who is so concerned with these other issues and, you know, trying to convey the importance of this heritage, the urgency of saving this heritage? They're dealing with things like global warming, the declining fish population, the declining bee population, war, terrorism, Donald Trump running for president. I mean, we have so many issues that we need to fix. And the children, the adults are very concerned with many, many urgent issues. So what I'm trying to convey is that I think we need to make greater efforts to reach out to the public, to reach out to students, to go give lectures, whether it's in middle schools or high schools or museums. We need to reach out to people beyond our academic sphere, because those are the people that are going to be voting on legislation. Those are the people who are going to be funding startups or technology that can invent the kind of technology we will need to document and protect heritage or recreate heritage which has been destroyed. So I want to simply challenge all of you to really try and be proactive in reaching out to the general public after you leave here today. So on that note, I would like to hand the forum over to Carla Chapreau and her panelists, and I invite you again to enjoy the wonderful art that's in the atrium, and I thank you very much for being here today. Thank you.
I want to thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for organizing this symposium and for all of you for coming today. We have a distinguished panel this morning, and before we begin our discussion, I want to introduce them to you. I guess I should say briefly, I teach art and cultural property law in the School of Law, UC Berkeley. I also do cultural property research in the Institute of European Studies, but not regarding antiquities. So we have here today Amir Al-Azam, is an associate professor of Middle East history and anthropology at Shawnee State University. He was educated in the UK, reading archaeology of Western Asiatics at the University of College London, and graduated with a doctoral degree in 1991. He excavated a number of sites, including, forgive my pronunciation or mispronunciation, Tel Hamukar in Syria, and one possibly associated with Genghis Khan's final resting place in Mongolia. He was director of scientific and conservation laboratories at the General Department of Antiquities and Museums from 1999 to 2004 in Syria, and head of the Center for Archaeological Research at the University of Damascus from 2003 to 2006. He has taught at the University of Damascus. Is that okay? Good. And served as Dean of the University of Requirements at the Arab European University. And from 2006 to 2009, he was a visiting assistant professor at Brigham Young University. Professor Al-Azim is an active member of the Syrian opposition. He serves on the executive committee of the Day After Project, which you'll be hearing about in a few moments. Patty Gerstenblith, to my right, is immediately to my right, is a distinguished research professor of law at DePaul University, director of its Center for Art, Museum, and Cultural Heritage Law. She is multi-talented. She has a PhD in art history and anthropology from Harvard and a Juris Doctor degree from Northwestern University. She founded the Lawyers Committee for Cultural Heritage Preservation, is a founding member and director of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, and senior advisor to the American Bar Association's Art and Cultural Heritage Law Committee. Professor Gerstenblith was appointed by President Obama to serve as the chair of the President's Cultural Property Advisory Committee in the United States Department of State, a very important position. She's published widely and spoken widely on the topic of art and cultural heritage law, including the casebook called Art, Cultural Heritage and the Law, which I use at UC Berkeley in my art law class. Next on my right, we have Susan Wolfenbarger, who's a director of the Geospatial Technology Project, a part of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law program of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, which I learned is called AAAS,
Yes.
Where she oversees the projects of AAAS that deal with the applications of geospatial technologies to a range of human rights and humanitarian issues. Dr. Wolfenbarger obtained her PhD in geography from the Ohio State University. Her research interests focus in part on the use of satellite remote sensing as evidence in legal cases, particularly those related to human rights and feminist and critical views of technology. She's published on the uses of remote sensing for land cover and land use change, forced migration, and environmental rights documentation. Dr. Wolfenbarger's work with the AAAS has led to a collaboration between the AAAS, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Smithsonian Institution regarding the issue of cultural heritage, targeting and destruction in conflict zones. And finally, to my far right is Susan Panaccio, who is the project manager for the American Schools of Oriental Research, ASOR, for their cultural heritage geospatial initiatives. She's responsible for satellite imagery analysis and the continuing growth of the heritage inventory. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2015, completing a dissertation on a spatial analysis of clay ceilings within Nubian fortresses of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. She previously worked as the associate director of the Center for Ancient Middle Eastern Landscapes at the Oriental Institute. As an archaeologist, she's worked in Egypt and Turkey, focusing on 2D and 3D site mapping and aerial photography. ASOR's Cultural Heritage Initiatives works in cooperation with the US State Department in an effort to document, protect, and preserve the cultural heritage of war-torn Syria and northern Iraq. So our experts today are very specially qualified to speak to you today. So the morning panel, as you know from the program, is tasked with exploring the political facets of cultural heritage looting, destruction, while also weaving in legal issues and educational issues. So I want to start this morning with a question for our panelists, and also provide each of them with an opportunity to provide the audience with some background about their specific work. So my question, to begin, is very, very current. In late February, a ceasefire in Syria was negotiated, and UN Syria envoy Staffan de Mistura has indicated he plans to resume UN-mediated peace talks next week in Geneva. Both the al-Assad government and just yesterday, the High Negotiating Committee, an umbrella group for the Syrian opposition factions, said they would also attend these peace talks next week. Those monitoring this very recent ceasefire have suggested that the violence has decreased, although I think there's there have been some violations of the ceasefire. So the question is, if you are at the peace talks in Geneva next week with the al-Assad government and the Syrian opposition representatives, what would be the single most important issue that you'd want to put on the table with respect to the protection of cultural heritage and property? And then also go into your background. And Professor Al-Azim, can you begin this discussion?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, thank you for sort of introducing it like this, and I think this will dovetail nicely with how you ended your talk about why we should care about cultural heritage, and in that frame, why perhaps if we were to be present at that table, what would I bring? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the issue of the binary that we often hear. You know, how can you care about stones? How can you care about monuments and buildings when there are people dying, when there are people drowning, when the country is falling apart? There's a humanitarian catastrophe of unparalleled proportions. According to Ban Ki-moon, it's the worst humanitarian catastrophe on record since the end of the Second World War. I think the only other comparable event in the last 50, 60 years was the breakup of India into Pakistan and India, and the migration of or displacement of some 10.2 million people. So how can, with all this happening, how can you be thinking about saving heritage or stones? And for me, I reject this binary. This is not an either or. It's not either you care about people or you care about heritage. You care about sort of humanitarian issues, or you care about sort of this ivory tower fantasy, you know, history thing. They're both totally interlocked. And I've said this before. At the end of the day, you know, people without their history, people without a connection to their past, people without a connection to their culture are nothing. They're lost people. What becomes of you then? How do you sort of how does this matrix survive that makes and helps a Syrian identify what makes him a Syrian if there's no connection between him and or her and her past? And at the same time, if we take these objects, these inanimate stones, these monuments, and take the people away from them, and take the connection that sort of binds them to, then they're just dead stones. You might as well walk into a museum. That, to me, that's why I find museums so sometimes difficult to relate to. And this is the challenge any museum has. How do I take something that is totally displaced out of its context and somehow allow a person to connect to it beyond just an abstract piece of work? And so for me, having your culture and having the people associated with this culture together is very important, and therefore saving Syria's cultural heritage becomes a very important issue to put to the table. And nowhere is this for me more relevant than perhaps at the peace talks, as you suggested, because really one has to pause and reflect on the fact that Syrian society has ruptured across every possible cleavage you can think of, socially, you know, religiously, culturally, everything. We've ruptured at every single possible level. And right now, you're trying to bring people who have so little in common, apparently, to sit around the same table and try to somehow work out a solution. And really, this is where cultural heritage for me becomes an interesting focal point, because despite this huge gulf that has opened up between the various warring parties, both sides seem to also consider their history and their heritage important. There are people right now on both sides of this divide who are risking their lives and who have died and who have suffered casualties trying to save this cultural heritage. And so for me, this is like a bridge, perhaps, that despite everything else we disagree on, there is something that we still agree on. There is something that both sides consider of value and worthwhile saving, and it is that shared common history. And if that's the case, then perhaps this is going to be the bridge, this is going to be one of the main points of access that Syrians will be able to begin to talk to each other again, to begin to build those bridges again that have been so terribly destroyed and ruptured by this conflict, irrespective of which side you're sitting on right now. And in so doing, we can begin to really hope for a chance for post-conflict reconciliation and stabilization. And so if this cultural heritage is being destroyed, it is being lost, it is being looted, then the last hope for me is also being lost with it. And therefore, saving Syria's past is about preserving its future too. Or I should say preserving its past is about saving its future. So that would kind of answer that. Do you want me to do more, or just sort of stop and then come back?
Do you have some slides you want to
share? I have 5 major points I was going to sort of talk about. I was going to introduce briefly, and then we can come back and revisit them as you develop your...
Okay.
Would you like me to do that?
Sure. Or if you want to show a few of them now to give a little bit of
sure. I mean,
background.
Well, the 5. I'll do that as I frame the 5 points.
Okay.
So this was point 1. This was my first point. Why it was important for us to save Syria's cultural heritage. And to reinforce this, I just wanted to remind our audience that Syria has 6 World Heritage Sites as listed by UNESCO. You know, for those of you who understand what this means, this is no mean feat. This is actually very significant in comparison to many other countries who have maybe 1 or 2. I think Egypt is on a par. I think China is catching up. But really, there aren't many countries that have 6 World Heritage Sites on the list. You're in a class of your own almost there. In terms of the second point I want to talk about is really the kind of damage that has been sustained by Syria's cultural heritage. And this goes back to the changing nature of the conflict, which really, in 2012, we began to notice. This was where you have a shift from street protests, civilian activism, basically going out on the streets protesting against the regime, and then being met with severe repression. And by 2012, this changes into one of armed confrontation between the regime and opposition groups. And it is here that we start to see cultural heritage become a major casualty of war, partly as a result of looting. That's one major cause of the destruction, and there are a number of reasons why this looting occurs, and I can sort of talk about that more later on. And another one is where essentially the cultural heritage becomes also a battlefield casualty because it's on the front lines. In terms of looting, this is a very famous, iconic photo, and there are better ones, and I'm sure my colleagues here will show us even more advanced ones. But this is the site of Apamea in 2011, and you can see here at the beginning of the conflict, this is what the site should look like. And then just 1 year later, you can see Apamea, and it's totally wrecked. And are you going to talk more about this, Apamea? Only a little. So I won't say any more. She can explain to you more what you're seeing on the slide. And again, we have actual, as I said, battlefield casualties. You can see here the Crac de Chevalier, another World Heritage Site. And it's being struck here by regime airstrikes because they were trying to dislodge opposition forces that had taken up sort of positions in the castle. They were using the castle for what it was intended to be, clearly. You know, it has a very imposing position. It controls the main highway, so that's where you need to be. And the regime was bombarding it. This is, again, a part of the collapsed wall of the citadel of Aleppo. This happened sort of last year, and it was as a result of they were trying to take out a regime sniper that was on the wall, that was using the parapets there. He was obviously using the high ground to do what it was intended to do, and they took him out, and unfortunately we lost part of the wall as well. And then again you have the Mara Museum, another casualty, a very important museum that contains a very valuable and almost unique collection of mosaics from the area known as the Dead Cities. And in June 2015, a barrel bomb was dropped on the museum, causing significant damage. I don't know if you can see here some of the mosaics that were outside got very badly damaged in the process, and you can see it here. Okay, and then but we did manage to save most of the mosaics. There's a happy ending to that story because of joint efforts to sandbag the contents of the museum and protect them. And this was a joint effort between the Smithsonian, the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and the TDA, the day after, the organization I'm sort of associated with. And so we have this effort to sandbag the mosaics. And so when the explosion happened, most of the mosaics, I think in fact all the mosaics inside the museum were actually saved. So that is as far as sort of the damage that we see. But then there is another manifestation of damage, and that brings me to my third point, and this is ISIS and the kind of damage they then bring into the onto the scene. And just a couple of points, and again, hopefully in the discussion we'll be able to revisit this in more detail. Look, ISIS did not start the looting. ISIS came upon a pre-existing situation. It intensified it, it accelerated, and most importantly, it institutionalized it through setting up this, for example, the Office of the Rikaz, which is the Office of or the Department of Resources, and they put cultural heritage, they put archaeology, cultural heritage, under the Office of Resources for a very simple reason, because ISIS sees and considers cultural heritage as an exploitable resource. You exploit it like you exploit mineral wealth, like you exploit oil, like you exploit any other means of raising income. And that's where they put it. They specifically put it under that department. And you can see here, this is their office in Manbij, and you can see they have a nice little banner up there that says Diwan al-Rikaz, you know, the Athar, basically the Diwan of Rikaz, the Diwan of Resources, and then the Department of Antiquities. And that's where all the, and the photo I don't show you is where the guy's name is up there and his phone number, so you can reach him day or night. It's very, you know, and they were issuing licenses like these. These are looting licenses, which actually provide permission to those who are then sort of given, you know, they have the right to go and loot. And again, very interesting to see, for those of you who read Arabic, you can do it, but it says permission is given to so-and-so to go and dig, excavate for antiquities in the village of, again, blanked out, obviously, conditional. It's a conditional permission that no harm is caused to Muslims. So, you know, there's some concern, and then obviously the name of the person in charge on their seal. But as a result of this intensification, as a result of this institutionalization, we now see the introduction of machinery. We see the you know, exploitation on a much grander and much more aggressive scale. And so here is an example of some of this machinery sort of digging up and used in looting. And you can see here some of those diggers actually carving out. And for those of you who are, well, you know, what are you finding? Is it really worthwhile? Are you know, how much can you dig out of this? Well, here's a sample of what's being, this is one grave, one hoard, one site. Okay, this is in the storeroom of that, of the looters that the looters have set up. And this is one site, licensed by ISIS, looted by ISIS, and sold in auction in Raqqa by ISIS. And this basically goes back to the end of the summer, fall 2015. So why does ISIS do all this? As I said, the looting itself is primarily to gain resources, to gain income. It's an exploitable resource. Like you sell oil, you sell antiquities. But there's a more sinister side to it as well, and I think that's the one that people most likely talk about, and that's the one probably that we'll get more questions about. Why do they then also destroy cultural heritage? What's the purpose of this destruction? Why are they doing it? And that brings me to my fourth point, and we see in 2015, you know, 2015 heralds this darker, more sinister manifestation of ISIS that begins with the destruction, you know, the very famous sort of publicized destruction of the museum in Mosul, and then it's followed by a series of other terrible acts. Now, I'm going to say very few words here, and then I'm going to sort of, again, leave that to be discussed later on. The most important thing is to see the destruction of cultural heritage in the grand standard way, where you have high-definition cameras, where you have this whole stage-managed event with music or a speaker reading or saying something behind it. This is a very well-crafted piece of propaganda. Okay, number one, do not see it as anything else. It is a well-crafted piece of propaganda. It is designed very specifically to demonstrate ISIS's ability to act with impunity and to highlight and demonstrate the impotence of both the international community and the local community, for that matter, or anyone else, to do anything to stop them. It is the combination of impunity and impotence. It's a very powerful combination. It resonates really well with their own narrow base of supporters. It helps improve their recruitment, and it sends a very clear message to the rest of the world. These are, and we class these as atrocities, at least I classify them as atrocities. And they are no different from any other atrocity that ISIS commits for exactly the same reason. So whether it's a poor unfortunate soul dressed up in an orange jumpsuit, and then you have the HD cameras, the staging, the whole thing, Jihadi John, well, he's there dead, but when, jumping up and down, doing his little song and dance, and the destruction of, highly publicized destruction of cultural heritage, these are part of the same repertoire of atrocities. Their purpose is to demonstrate ability to act with impunity and impotence of international community or anyone else to do anything about it. And that is very different from the selling and looting of antiquities. But they both fall under the same umbrella of exploitation. In short, ISIS exploits cultural heritage in as many ways as it can. It loots what it can sell, it destroys for propaganda, publicity, or any other reason that it cares to what it cannot. And sometimes the propaganda and the publicity is for their own internal consumption. It doesn't just have to be for the international, for outside. It could be just to reinforce a certain narrative among, or study the ranks. Often we see those atrocities being committed in and around the time when they have setbacks on the battlefield, or they have some internal issue. And there are nuances to all of this. It's not black and white. But in general, that's the main thing. And so we see these terrible, terrible images then. But these are part of a carefully crafted propaganda camp. This is the Temple of Bel, before and after. These are the most recent. These are about 2-3 weeks old. And I don't know if you can see here, that is all that is left of the Temple of Bel. These were taken from a little bit from this, but these are about 2.5 weeks old, these photos. And finally, the fifth point, and I'm not going to say much about it, but I want to put it on the table for you to come back to, and that is explaining and interpreting the destruction of shrines and places of worship. That is a whole different kettle of fish, and you should not put it in the category of atrocities for propaganda. That is a completely different thing. The first category that I talked about, the destruction of cultural heritage or monuments, that is straightforward propaganda. That has no religious role, and any religion associated, any religious justification provided, is simply to justify the atrocity. The atrocity is not committed to fulfill a religious obligation. It is committed for political, temporal, mundane reasons, and then a religious sort of justification, legitimization is provided to legitimize the atrocity. This, on the other hand, is done for religious purposes, and it's a completely different kettle of fish, and you have to discriminate between them. And I can explain that in much more detail if you come back to it, given time. Okay. All right? Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
I didn't say anything about what we are working on. I'm hoping that later on I can show you, because this is all grim and bad. I do have a happy dance at the end that, if given time, I'll come back to as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yes. So, Dr. Wolfenbarger, maybe you could, I don't know whether you have an answer in your imagination to the question, and then also give us a little bit of background on what your work involves.
Okay. I think I might want to flip it back around and start
however
with
you
the
want
background,
to organize it,
because I think
fine.
that my answer isn't going to make much sense without
Excellent.
telling people
What
more
you
about
do.
the work that I do, and
Excellent.
then my answer will make complete sense.
Thank you.
So maybe I could start with the. Oh, okay.
You can use my slides, they're just as nice.
Yeah, I do you have notes I could use? Do I still have my job records? Okay. So I wanted to talk first a little bit about the work that I do at AAAS, because it's quite a bit. It covers a very wide range of things that I think are relevant to today's topic in a lot of ways. But first, I direct a project called Geospatial Technologies Project. So what we do is that we work globally with a wide range of partners to find ways to document different issues that may be difficult to understand due to lack of access to locations, whether people can't go because there's an active conflict zone, whether it's a remote location, whether investigators have been denied entry. We look for ways to use technology to give people a way to look in at what's happening on the ground around the world. And so that's kind of just the quick background on the reasons for the technology in our work. So most of what I do has been historically focused on human rights documentation. And I was really happy last night in Patty's discussion that, and in some other discussions recently, that I have heard that people are starting to bring the discussion of cultural heritage back into this wider framing of human rights, because obviously the right to culture, the right to practice your culture, your religion, all of these things are part of international human rights. And so I'm very happy, and that's going to tie into my answer about the peace talks and where we're going next. But I do want to talk about, okay, so this is, no, that's, okay, sorry about that. So basically we partner with a lot of human rights groups. I think that's kind of where I was going. So we work with large global human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, and we work to help them document issues that they're having trouble with on the ground. So for example, in Syria, we've been doing projects since 2012, actually. We started our documentation work there in Aleppo with Amnesty International, because there were a lot of concerns very early on in the conflict about the issues around civilians and what was happening to them, documenting what was happening in Aleppo. So one of the first things that I did in relation to the Syrian civil war was it was a 9-month study of Aleppo and all of the damage that was happening across the entire city. Over time, we were looking at civilian infrastructure destruction. We were looking at roadblocks, because obviously roadblocks were a key issue in who was controlling which neighborhoods of the city, the flow of goods into the different areas. So we started off with looking at the human rights implications of the conflict on the ground. And as a part of that, I'm a geographer, and obviously I focus on human rights. We were talking about the fact that the entire center of Aleppo is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that we felt that cultural heritage wasn't being highlighted in anyone's human rights work. And so in that first report, we included an entire section that highlighted that particular issue of the World Heritage Site and the damage that was happening to all the various parts of the center of Aleppo. So another part of the work I do at AAAS, and this is also going to eventually tie back into my answer of the question, is about prosecutions. I work a lot with international, the regional human rights courts and commissions. So the International Criminal Court, the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And my team and I have been working for a number of years to improve the quality of evidence that's used in prosecutions. So satellite imagery in particular can be a really important way to demonstrate the widespread and systematic nature of a lot of conflicts and provide very specific documentation of the destruction of particular locations, targeting types of information. We've done work in the past where we can trace the trajectories of bombs that have fallen. You can look at the ejecta patterns and trace back where they were fired from and trace them back to military bases. There's a lot of things that you can do with satellite imagery to contribute to international prosecutions. And so I think that obviously cultural heritage documentation that's going on by groups like my group and Susan's group at ASOR and others, I think that those are going to become really important later on down the line. So I will actually talk about the slide that you've probably been looking at above my head for the past few minutes. And so our work early on in Aleppo led us into this partnership with the Smithsonian Institution and the University of Pennsylvania. And we together went and obtained a National Science Foundation grant. You can see the long title of the planning grant at the top of my slide. But we are also a part of a larger consortium called SHOSI, Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq, that brings together a lot of different organizations like Amar's organization the day after, and we implement a lot of training and emergency response efforts in addition to the satellite imagery documentation that I'm going to focus on, because that's what I'm doing as a part of the SHOSI consortium. So AAAS has just, and when I say just, I mean we are literally this week finishing up the first what I'm calling the scientifically rigorous study of cultural heritage destruction in a conflict. And by that, I mean that we created a data set of cultural heritage sites in Syria. We categorized that into 10 different types of cultural heritage. We're looking at religious sites, archaeological sites, cemeteries, libraries, archives. There's a number of more because there's 10, but I can't think of all of them right now, of course. But basically, we, out of those 10 different categories, created a stratified random sample that we have just finished the analysis of. And so we're not just looking at an individual museum when we're doing our analysis. We do a type of a forensic analysis of sites. So we look at each and every site across the entire conflict from 2011, and our current data set ends at 2014. We also analyze the areas around each site to look at other issues that are happening in the area, and I'll talk about that after I show you just a couple of quick examples, just so that you get an idea of the type of things that we look at. Obviously, looting is something that's already come up a couple of times, and I'm only the fourth person to talk this morning, and so I wanted to show you kind of an example of some of basically the worst looting that we've seen in Syria. So this is a Dura Europos. This image is from 2014. The main site is the area that's in the pink color, and when we went to look at Dura Europos, the looting was so bad at the site that we couldn't tell one looter's pit from another. So we actually had to just look at the entire area of the site and calculate the parts that weren't damaged, and then say it in those kinds of terms, because the looting was so intensive. And on the other side of the screen is kind of a zoomed in part of that box that you see on the left. So you can see, each block within the site is completely looted out, and then the yellow area is the expansion outside of the main part of the site. And so the looting is continuing. We've been looking at more recent imagery, but this was a nice graphic that I had already prepared. The looting is continuing to expand further outside of the site. So this is, I think, a really good example of the issue that Amr was talking about, much more in depth on and understanding how these things happen. This is just some of the ways that we're showing, that we know that it's happening at a large scale, because we see it at so many different sites across the country. Another one of the main issues that we have been documenting, and that's been common across the sites, has been military occupation. So this is the site of Ebla. On the left is from 2011. at each of the sites, we basically look to determine up until the last point when it is intact, and then we start looking at every single satellite image that we can get to document the expansion of the destruction. So this was the latest image of Ebla is on your right, and so you can see there are a variety of military encampment features there. There are a lot of revetments, there's berms, there was actually an encampment in the middle of the berms here. So we see a lot of this, particularly on the tells, because they are elevated above the surrounding landscape. So obviously a lot of these sites are of particularly military significance because you have the high ground. One of the other issues that we weren't expecting quite as much going in, I mean, obviously we knew that there was going to be destruction at sites from the military, from looting. One of the things that we weren't thinking so much about, but that we saw was I'm calling it human encroachment on sites. So this site has a number of buildings that have been built. The archaeological site itself was within a small village, and so over time we see structures being built further into the site. I would say that it's likely due to the breakdown of the ability to actually monitor sites and have people at the different sites to keep those things from happening. Also at this site, we saw some of the ancient walls kind of disappearing, so people are taking apart walls and using them as building materials. So that's another thing that we've seen in our analysis that we weren't expecting quite as much. And then we have what Amr was talking about, these very performative acts of destruction. This is in Raqqa. This is a time series very early on. We also did a similar analysis of Nebi Yunus, the tomb of the prophet Jonah. That was one of the earlier examples of this type of...
That's the one I had the explosion of.
That's the Nebi Yunus was the explosion? Okay. Yeah. So we started seeing... so this was in the summer and fall of 2014. This phenomenon was when we started seeing this happening much more. We were seeing that ISIS is not just destroying a site, so the tombs here have been blown up, as Amr was showing you, but then ISIS also goes in later and bulldozes the site and removes the remains of the site. So they're erasing all of the history of that site. They don't want to even leave rubble behind for people to go to. They want to completely erase its existence. And so this is happening more and more at sites, and it's one of the things that just, I think it's one of the things that really hurts people more than practically anything else that we're seeing. Then I think I already mentioned this partially, but what we're doing is not in addition to just looking at individual sites. So if a site in our sample is a museum, we're not just looking at the museum, we're looking at the entire area around that museum. So this is just on the left is the sites in our sample that are in Aleppo, but on the right is actually the damage assessment of Aleppo. So we're not only interested in looking at just what happened to a specific building. We are going through the entire surrounding area. We're looking for civilian structures destroyed. We're looking at roadblocks. We're looking at basically any type of changes that are happening in these areas, because we hope that as part of this consortium project, what we're doing is AAAS has done this documentation geospatially. The University of Pennsylvania has been gathering media data and doing similar coding for acts of destruction. And the University of Maryland is building a data set of the combatant groups and their movements over time. And so we're going to put all of these different data sets together and hopefully be able to actually systematically look at the sites that are damaged, the sites that weren't damaged, and try to come up with some reasons why these things are happening. And so that's really the focus of my work right now in relation to cultural heritage. So I think that you kind of probably can guess what my answer to I'm a long time coming to my answer about the ceasefire and peace talks in Syria. Obviously, I think that cultural heritage needs to be examined alongside human rights violations, because all of these things are happening together. All of these things are happening to the people of Syria. We need to be able to bring all of this together, I think, in a number of different ways. I mean, I really think that obviously transitional justice types of mechanisms are needed. I think that accountability, obviously that's what I focus on is accountability. So obviously I would want to have some sort of prosecutions based on this is not just ISIS, this is all sides of the conflict. Everybody is destroying things. I think that I think accountability is one of the most important things that I would want to see happen coming out of all of this, because there haven't really, as Patty was saying last night, there's not been prosecutions based on, well, there's been one, I guess, based on cultural property.
And we'll talk about enforcement of
right.
national and international laws
right.
as we move along.
I don't want to
that's
get into that
point.
too much, but I think that we have the information that would let us do that in this case.
Great.
So very, very long way.
No, it's good. Thank you. It's important to get the background of what you're doing as well. And Dr. Panacho, also the question, and give the audience some information about your work in the area.
It's actually in my bag where that blue coat is. Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure I have necessarily a great answer.
And that's okay. There may not be an answer that's easily
a good thing. I do think that as we're seeing now, and even through the ceasefire, where we're continuing to see damage happening to sites and to small villages from all of these airstrikes, I think what is something that needs to be addressed, I think, even more, is this continuing bombing and kind of, they're claiming they're bombing targets, but it seems to be a lot of villages. It's often archaeological sites in those villages, and they're being destroyed kind of all over the place, especially within the Aleppo countryside, where we're seeing all of these Russian airstrikes taking place, or we're seeing the regime bombing, we're seeing coalition bombing, and it's sort of, this is showing up in our satellite imagery now, where we're seeing the extent of damage happening, not just to cultural heritage sites, but to the areas around them and to villages. I think that's something that it's continuing, and we're still getting reports of bombing in Syria and Iraq during this ceasefire, and I think it's something that, how do you, and your question of enforcement and how do you enforce these kind of rules is something that I think needs to kind of be looked at a lot closer, and how much we can do, or not do, I guess, about this kind of damage that's happening. And so I guess that sort of feeds into, I want to give a brief overview, and I wrote it down so that I didn't go too long, on our project, the ASOR CHI, or the American Schools of Oriental Research Cultural Heritage Initiatives. This project originally started as the Syrian Heritage Initiative, and then in the last year we've now expanded to include northern Iraq, and specifically ISIL-held areas, or what we kind of term ISIL-held areas, so primarily just the northern portion of Iraq. ASOR CHI was created through a collaboration with the U.S. Department of State in the summer of 2014, under the co-direction of Michael Dante, Scott Branting, Jesse Kasana, Andy Vaughn, and Abdulrazak Moaz. And there are now a host of co-collaborators and project staff working to collect and analyze new data. And as my job as a project manager for geospatial initiatives, I direct our ongoing growth of our cultural heritage inventory and the use and analysis of all of our satellite imagery for continuing analysis of damage to sites, as well as visual presentation of that damage as part of our larger outreach program. So the aim of the project is threefold. First, it is to document damage to Syria and Iraq as it happens. And second is to promote awareness of the damage taking place in these conflict zones. And thirdly, to plan emergency and post-war responses and mitigation of that damage. Damage is documented in a few different ways. We use open source information, such as the media and social media accounts. We look at human sources, so we get information from on the ground, things like the day after.
I just sent you the Ebla. Did you see the Ebla ones?
I haven't, but
Oh, they're good.
we include his reports in our weekly reports to make them available to the public. Very detailed information from people who are actually there and able to look at it, as well as we look at satellite imagery to be able to see these inaccessible areas. ASOR then creates these bi-weekly reports, which include a summary of the events during that reporting period, an outline of ongoing active conflict zones, an analysis of any new satellite imagery, and a number of incident reports for damage specific to sites, and kind of a much larger detailing of the media available, what we see in satellite imagery, as well as then what the report is actually saying and where it fits within the larger pattern of damage within Syria. We have also created a few special reports on sites when there's a more significant or a larger event, such as the events at Palmyra in September of 2015, which damage is still ongoing, and we're continuing to watch that, as well as to the damage that was done to the Northwest Palace of Nimrud in April of 2015 when ISIL destroyed that area. We are continuing to hope to produce more of these in-depth analyses during the next 6 months. There's been fewer reports of damage with the ceasefire, so we're hoping to kind of get a break from the barrage of damage that we continually are updating to be able to look at like the wider view again rather than very, very specific reports of damage. And all of these are then published on the ASOR CHI website and made available to the public so that they can also follow what is happening in the area. We also are working with various groups in country to do on-ground assessment of sites when it's possible and safe for them to be in the area. CHI has prepared a series of basic photo documentation guides for sites and artifacts in Arabic, which are then distributed to our contacts in Syria so that we can get back the information that we would like.
These are the ones we use.
Exactly. They're being ground tested now, so we'll know if they worked well. This has allowed us to get very detailed information as well as like sketch maps, information about what exactly they're seeing, photographs and where those photographs are being taken for us to be able to continually analyze. We're also providing support to groups working to document and preserve heritage on the ground through technical advice and funding supplies, and are continuing to develop proposals for individual large-scale projects that could be undertaken in the post-conflict period or as emergency proposals as an important part of Syria's recovery and revitalization. In addition to the reporting that is published, we also have a large amount of collected data which we are archiving for future use by other groups and eventually as part of the rebuilding effort. Data management forms an important portion of the project, which we are then eventually hoping to then pass on to someone else to be able to deal with in the long term. And this includes locational data and description of sites, observations from outside sources, which we call heritage observations, various forms of media, photos, and video, associated satellite imagery and assessment, as well as then associated incident reports for these sites. And then all of these are going into the creation of condition assessment or overall condition of every site in our inventory, eventually being done by our conservation team. During the course of the project, we've compiled an inventory of sites in Syria and Iraq based on various survey data and shared inventories from other projects such as Crane at the University of Toronto and CAST at the University of Arkansas. As of now, we have approximately 6,700 sites within the inventory, and I'm using this term loosely, the sites. These include archaeological sites, but it's also built heritage such as museums, sites of religious significance, and historical buildings. We're continuing to grow this data pretty much on a daily basis. It's been important for us to create a single location where all of this data is being stored to make it possible to not only monitor this large number of sites, as well as the many more that we're continuing to add, but also to create collaboration with other groups. In year one, so up until November of this year, ASOR reported on specific incidents of damage to approximately 400 sites within Syria. These were compiled based on media sources, in-country reporting, and satellite analysis. Each report discusses the damage at that site and the actions that caused it, sometimes being able to attribute it to a specific group, as well as then possible mitigation plans for dealing with this damage once it's possible. This map is only showing our reports that mention military activity, and this is broken down into specifically intentional destructions, explosives, gunfire, the use of heavy machinery, military construction, and military occupation of sites. And so we can see some clustering just in this fairly small sample of our damaged sites, such as at the city of Aleppo, which we know has been badly damaged due to tunnel bombs and large explosions, especially around and to the southwest of the citadel, which I'll show in a few slides, as well as Palmyra, which has been the site of multiple intentional destructions of not only the temples we've talked about, but also tombs and shrines in the area. So once we've compiled all of this data, our goal is to use the ARCHES platform created by the Getty Conservation Institute and World Monuments Fund to share our data across this platform that is open source. It's still in development, and we're still working with the Getty Conservation Institute to create the platform that will be most useful for us and for other heritage groups. It will enable us to share site location, site description, the condition assessment were created, various management plans, and satellite imagery. We see this as a great way to share our data with other groups who are either currently using ARCHES or who we might be able to use it in the future. And this includes our current collaboration with Shirin at the University of Durham and Endangered Archaeology of the Middle East and North Africa, or AMENA, based at Oxford and Leicester. So far, this is the work that I've been doing. This map is based only on satellite analysis, and this is something we called a quick assessment of the majority of sites in our inventory to create a baseline of damage within Syria. We have looked at approximately 6,000 sites in Syria, looking only at what is the most recently available satellite image, and we've been able to do this because of a collaboration with Digital Globe and NGA, who gave us access to satellite imagery that we wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. We categorize them based on very basic categories, so severe, some damage, minor damage, and then no visible damage. And now we're going back and more thoroughly assessing those that we have marked as having some sort of damage and we've created a better terminology to be able to better pinpoint what sorts of things are doing this damage, whether it's military-based, human-based. We're seeing a large amount of movement of refugees into the dead cities in particular, who are now moving into these sites and creating a new layer of archaeology that we can go back and look at, but that they're now using these older structures to house themselves. And so as new satellite imagery is becoming available, we're continuing to assess all sites for new damage and to then refine kind of what we were looking at and what we're identifying. I want to go quickly through a few examples of satellite imagery. Obviously, this is Apamea, which we've all talked about. This image is from November of 2015, and what we're now seeing is not necessarily a large expansion of looting, but that these pits are now eroding, and we're seeing they're now exposure to the natural elements, and that you're seeing some of this, there's now growth in them. You kind of see their edges become less defined, and so it's no longer this area, especially in the middle of the site where this clip is taken from. It's not continued looting, but it is continuing damage to the site. The recent increase in airstrikes means that we're noticing an increase in military activity and disturbances to sites in Syria, particularly with military occupations seen on tell sites, as Susan mentioned earlier. This unnamed site in Syria shows as early as 2013 that there's a large military occupation at this site, including these round features, which are air missile defense systems. This is an actually much more advanced version of the military damage that we see. Most of them just have trenches, some sort of road often up to the top of the tell. Occasionally bunkers are built into these sites, but it's sort of been a mix, and over the last few months we've been seeing a much larger building of these trenching and embankments on tells, specifically within the Aleppo governorate. And so to that, this is a picture from January, the end of January 2016, of the site of Tel Querish Sharki, I'm gonna butcher that name, in Aleppo. And you can see here the arrows where we're seeing construction of embankments and some defenses on the small tell in the southern part of the site, as well as a large amount of damage being done to the village and buildings in the village itself, and visible bomb craters from airstrikes that occurred. We're also using our satellite imagery to corroborate all these reports of destruction. Sometimes the media reports on something that didn't actually happen, or they exaggerate what happened to the surprise of no one. And so, as is available, we're then going back and looking at the satellite imagery to see what is actually happening. Palmyra, obviously, you can see the red dots, which are noting damaged or destroyed sites. And we're continuing to get reports of damage to the site, but we haven't been able to elaborate on that because our satellite imagery is not being updated at the moment because it's a military target, and thus we haven't been able to get very good information. Over the summer, when ISIL intentionally destroyed multiple temples and shrines on and around Palmyra, and subsequently published videos of these explosions, we were able to look at the satellite imagery that was updated in August to identify the destruction of not only these temples and the extent that the damage was done to the temples, but to also look at the tower tombs around the site, which ISIL did not publicize, but were also destroyed around the same time. And so this is something that satellite imagery has been very helpful for, to look at the timeline of damage being done. So in this case, these are the tower tombs in one of the cemeteries at Palmyra, and these were destroyed in actually 2 phases. In around the end of August, between June and August, we know that the tomb here, the tomb of Imliku, was destroyed in a blast that also partially damaged the tomb to its east. And then between August 27th and September 2nd, surprisingly close satellite imagery, we're able to see that there are 2 more tombs that were also destroyed in a separate intentional destruction, completely bombed, but never publicized by ISIL. This is something that we've never actually seen reports on. And lastly, the ASOR conservation team are creating an overall condition for each site using all of the available reports that we're collecting. This can be used to identify which sites need immediate conservation once the conflict ends, and to create kind of a rapid assessment planning for post-conflict. We use 6 broad categories to classify threats and disturbances, so we're looking not only at military, but then at agricultural development, human development or construction on sites, human activities around sites, military, natural impacts, and then site management, or who's actually looking at the site at any one time. And the condition of a cultural property then indicates to what degree an entire site is physically stable or is experiencing active deterioration. We focused primarily in Aleppo at the beginning of this as a trial run for these overall condition assessments, where the fighting had been particularly intense and we had a fair amount of information about what was going on. 264 individual cultural heritage properties were assessed, with 45% of those marked as in good to fair condition, seen here in the purple and green on this slide. We can see that those in the poorest condition are grouped to the southwest of the citadel, where fighting has been the most intense and where multiple tunnel bombs have badly damaged the area. And these are continuing to be assessed and updated as more information becomes available. Aleppo is one of these areas we didn't get very much information for a while until November, when multiple satellite images came out, and we've now been able to update damage to the site, which was not as bad as initially feared, but it's still ongoing. We're also mapping patterns in types of disturbances. And so in this case, all the Aleppo sites were coded based on whether they had military or human disturbance. Much of the damage to Aleppo has been through military, so bombing, tunnel bombing, gunfire, occupation, barrel bombs, all of that. And then there's also been some human activity damage, such as theft and vandalism. And these two types of disturbances are often at the same locations. And so you can see that in the diagram on the left. And so I hope this has sort of given a good overview of what we're doing at ASOR-CHI. It's a wide-ranging project. And I want to acknowledge the many, many people who work with us and assist us in our project. And all of our information is available at asorsyrianheritage.org. And you can download and look at all of our reports as they become available.
Great. Thank you very much. So the issue of enforcement has come up, and yes, I would like you to answer the question, and I would like Professor Professor Gerstenbluth also to talk about, we realize there's this damage. We've heard a lot about many issues, but in October, UNESCO Director General Irina Bokova said there will be no impunity for war criminals, and UNESCO will make every effort in close cooperation with the International Criminal Court to make sure that the perpetrators of the destruction are tried and punished. Now, I want to actually address two issues. First, Professor Gerstenbluth spoke last night about the challenges of accountability and enforcement of international law and national law. And you mentioned the International Criminal Court, potential for ad hoc military tribunals authorized by the UN Security Council, and national law. And you actually mentioned a very interesting Iraqi national law and the ramifications. And then after that, I think I would like to address the issue of our own national legislation, pending bills in Congress, and how we are dealing with, currently we don't actually have laws that are going to restrict import specifically of Syrian goods that may have been looted. And so, why don't we speak first, because there have been concerns raised about the enforcement issue.
Well, actually, I'm going to, the notes that I took over the last hour and a half, I would like to make some comments about, and then I'll go to you.
Great.
Combination of your questions. First of all, the point that's been made that the peace talks are not going to stop ISIL, have almost nothing to do with ISIL. That destruction is going to go on. And the points that have been made about the continuing bombing, particularly by the Russians, we don't have necessarily any indication of whether Russia is in fact following international law in terms of not targeting. The little we know is that they are violating that in respect with other civilian and humanitarian objects. So that's a big problem. The peace talks should recognize that only the end of hostilities will protect cultural heritage. Everything that everybody is doing, with only a very few and minor exceptions, nothing is actually protecting cultural heritage. It's documenting destruction. That's not the same as protecting and preserving heritage. And people need to recognize that all these efforts, as wonderful and admirable as they are, is documenting, not preventing and protecting. And that's a big difference. A third point, I'll leave the criminal prosecution, which I was going to talk about for a moment. One of the things I'm very concerned about, and that I think we can see, is in a lot of these discussions, if you listen to the names of all the organizations that are involved, and this, I think, will also bleed into the peace talks, or at some point when there is a peace talk, is in fact what we're seeing, I think, is a lot of neo-colonialism rearing its head again. And the Western Europe and the United States, particularly the leadership of the State Department, is in fact reinstituting, could easily be viewed as reinstituting a neo-colonialist perspective that the Westerners are going to come in, they're going to carve up Syria, they're going to award money to whether it's the World Monuments Fund or other organizations, and where are the Syrians in this? And already at some of the conferences we've been at, we've seen UNESCO, for example, picking who the winner is going to be. It's going to be the DGIM, the people who are there right now in the Assad government are going to be put back in charge of reconstructing the heritage that, at least on a broader scale, have not been able to protect it. I mean, I know that's a very political statement, but I think it has to be recognized. This is almost like going back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 100 years ago. And I think we need to be aware of that. I know that some Syrian nationals are involved in these efforts, but we should not be sitting here deciding how Syria will be reconstructed in the future. This is not, as a Westerner, this is not our job. We may be able to be there to help, and there may be funding, but the Germans, the British, the French, and the Americans are already talking about what sites are they each going to be in charge of to reconstruct after the hostilities end. And I think that's very problematic. I don't know what point I'm up to, but I wanted to pick up on, particularly on what Susan Wolfenbarger said about the need for criminal prosecutions, the Assad regime and others. We tend to view this as an ISIL problem. It's not just an ISIL problem. We have to bring everybody into this. There was a blueprint for a possible criminal indictment called the Chautauqua Blueprint that was written several years ago, and it's extremely inadequate from the cultural heritage perspective. In fact, for those of you who heard my lecture last night, it basically reiterates the 1907 Hague Convention. It does not bring in any principles that are more recent than 1907. And that, again, is really problematic, and that needs to be rethought. There's also the option of prosecutions in domestic or using domestic law, whether it's by an international tribunal or a domestic tribunal, of the Syrian law, which has some very strict penalties, and what Carla referred to as the Iraqi law actually has the death penalty for looting and smuggling of antiquities. And I'm not suggesting, don't anybody misstate me, I'm not suggesting carrying out the death penalty for that, but it does perhaps have better criminal penalties than international law may have at the moment.
Well, and let me just interject something here, since for Iraq, for example, can you make a comment as you're moving along on deterrence? If you have these laws,
well,
is there any deterrent effect from your perspective?
At the moment, there is not any deterrent effect. War crimes prosecutions, at least, tend to always be, the people who are prosecuted are generally the losers. It's not the people who win a war. No one goes into a war thinking they're going to be the loser. If they think they're going to lose the war, they don't start a war. So the people who get prosecuted at the end are generally the people who've lost. So if you think you're not going to lose, then you think you're not going to be prosecuted. Therefore, it's not a deterrent. Of course, ideally, one of the main purposes of punishment, criminal punishment, is to be deterrent. But so far, I'm not so naive as to think that that's actually having effect. But that goes for all of it. International humanitarian law. Amr mentioned the beheadings of various people. All of this and a wide range of other conduct violates all kinds of international humanitarian law. It's not been a deterrent there either. That, to me, is not a reason not to have the law and not to prosecute people. Right. But and it's always, hopefully, the next person that you're going to deter. Obviously, the person who's already done it has not been deterred. So we still want to see that going forward. Now, I had a couple other notes here before I get into your other question. Let me just... I wanted to pick up on something that Susan Wolfenbarger mentioned about bringing, which I didn't mention last night, bringing cultural heritage and cultural rights together, which is there's a new special rapporteur for the United Nations Human Rights Council. She is the rapporteur on cultural rights, and she has included in her most recent report, her first and the most recent report, and she will actually on the 10th, that was 2 days ago, she did her first presentation to the UN, to the Council, on the inclusion, at least of intentional cultural heritage destruction within human rights. So that's another little piece there to try to bring these different things together. I think that was my notes that I had. Okay. But you wanted me to talk about the domestic legislation?
Well, I do want you to talk about the domestic legislation, but there have been comments. Oh, yes.
I have a couple of points to add to Patty, because I think you bring to, just clarifying something on UNESCO.
I had a point about UNESCO, okay, yes.
You want to do your point on UNESCO then?
Okay. This is the, I found UNESCO to be remarkably ineffective overall. maybe I shouldn't say the word remarkably, but. And there is something, even just from a legal perspective, that UNESCO could be doing and is not doing. And that's not with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but with the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which most of what the ICJ does is it handles disputes between countries. That's their adversarial proceedings. That would not be relevant at this point in time because the two countries have to consent to jurisdiction for that purpose. But in fact, the ICJ can issue an advisory opinion. Now, only a few organizations have the ability to request an advisory opinion from the ICJ. But one of those few organizations that could do it is UNESCO. And this has been suggested by others, and I have picked up on that suggestion, particularly a professor in China named Marina Losal has suggested it. And one answer I get is, well, we don't need an opinion from the ICJ because we know what ISIL's doing is a war crime. Fine, yes. But what we don't know is some of what I referred to last night. We don't know, for example, when the Mara Museum was bombed. And if it wasn't done intentionally, it was done perhaps through reckless disregard or extreme negligence. Does that satisfy the intentionality requirement under international law? So there are things that an advisory opinion from the ICJ as to which exact actions have violated international law would at least be helpful. I'm not saying it's going to deter anything, but it would really be helpful so that we could all stop. There's a lot of words that get thrown around, a lot of terms, genocide, atrocity, excuse me, Amr, other things, war crime, crime against humanity, crime against the law of nations. All these terms are being thrown around, and they are mostly being thrown around very imprecisely. And it would help if the ICJ could perhaps set the record straight from that perspective. So that's something very concrete, specific UNESCO could do, and has chosen not to do for reasons that I do not understand.
And in terms of international enforcement, either the ICC, which may not have jurisdiction,
right?
Which
well, the
is
ICJ wouldn't have jurisdiction.
Would
either,
not because
unless
of
the
the Rome Treaty.
Well, the ICJ is different. That's a dispute between countries,
right?
Like the Prey Vihar case I referred to. Cambodia and Thailand, they had a border dispute. They submitted it to the ICJ. The ICJ solved it. You know, or not necessarily to everybody's happiness, but they, issued an opinion on it. So it's usually more about commercial relations and things like that.
So if you
this would be an advisory opinion that they could do.
But in terms of actual prosecution for a war crime and maybe an ad hoc military tribunal, using perhaps the advisory decision.
Well, the advisory decision would go a long way towards setting out, what an indictment could look like.
So that could be a possible roadmap if you could capture a faceless. Well, I guess there are.
Well, then we have to turn to the technology people to give us the information.
Right. I just want to bring two things up here, which I think kind of explain or maybe highlight and maybe give us an opening to the other end of this issue. First, I just want to remind people that UNESCO is a club of member states. All right, and so and the Syrian state, as represented by its regime, is still a member of that club. The Syrian regime state representative sits at UNESCO. And so that is one of the problems of working with UNESCO and that UNESCO has, in that it cannot not represent the state, and therefore that is why the DGM, which is the state sort of institution, is really the one that is always to the forefront. And whilst I don't want to sort of take away from the work they have been able to do, I mean, Mamoun Abdel Karim, who heads the DGM, has done some incredible work, and we shouldn't sort of disregard that. But at the end of the day, the real problem for UNESCO and for the DGM is that they can only work in areas under state control. And currently, if you look at the map of Syria, and if I had a map, I'd throw it up for you, I can show you that the regime controls, give or take, plus or minus 30% of the country. So there's another 70% of Syria's cultural heritage that is outside the control of the DGM, outside the control of the state. And that is the area where we work, organizations like myself work on the ground, and yet UNESCO has yet to find a mechanism to work with people like ourselves. UNESCO is incapable, unfortunately, and not out of malice or out of ill will, but simply because of the way it's set up. It is incapable of working with non-state actors because it is there for states, by states, And it's hard enough for us to even be able to work with sort of other institutions, the government institutions, let alone UNESCO. And that is really, I think, part of the fundamental problem that UNESCO has, and that is why it can never really be effective in a place like Syria, where 70% of the country and most of the work in that area is done by non-state actors. The other thing that we were talking about deterrence, I just want to briefly throw in the other end of the spectrum, in that so far a lot of the conversation is focused on, well, can we do anything to stop it from the ground end? But I think deterrence has to be, and like anything else, a great journal once said that if you want to take a bridge, you have to take it from both ends if you want to be successful at this. And so the bridge here, you can't just stop it from one end. You can't stop it from the looting end. You can't stop it from the market end independently of the other. They have to sort of go hand in hand. So as we talk about deterrence, I would like to see the arguments being developed in terms of, here is maybe a complete package where we do what we can to sort of reduce the demand side, and we also do what we can to reduce or disrupt, if you want, the ability of people on the ground end to sort of loot as well. And only then you will have effective sort of action. But to try and do it from one end or from the other end, to only prosecute those who destroyed but not to prosecute those who sort of benefited, or vice versa, I think you'll always end up with a mismatch.
Okay, well, and that leads nicely into the discussion of domestic pending bills. We have Senate Bill 1887, House Bill 1493, which was just amended in February, and we also have House Bill 2285, and these they have to do with the emergency situation in Syria, and maybe Professor Gershenbluth could comment on those briefly.
Sure. Well, the two main ones, which are sort of the same, the House Bill 1493 and Senate 1887. I'm sure those numbers are all very exciting to you. But that legislation, which has been moving through in various ways for about a year and a half, or a little longer than a year and a half now, has had two components to it. One is what we call the coordination component, which originally was intended to set up a coordinating committee that would coordinate all of the federal government agencies that work on cultural property protection issues abroad, so outside of the United States, although including things that come to the United States from outside of the United States. And it would have involved the Department of Defense, the State Department, the Justice Department, Homeland Security, and also the sort of quasi-government, the Smithsonian, and even some non-government entities such as the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, which I talked about last night, and which, as a side note, in response also to Amar's, that we're also working on those no-strike lists that I mentioned last night, which is the other end of trying to stop the damage and destruction from the air, at least at the moment, and to the extent there are troops on the ground. So originally, the coordinating committee was going to be run out of the White House, the National Security Council, which of course is above all of the administrative agencies. That has morphed through several varieties. The first big change was that the person running it was going to be changed to be somebody in the State Department at the Assistant Secretary level. And then in the most recent version of the bill, which came through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just at the end of January, that was changed again. Instead of requiring the creation of the coordination committee, it is a sense of Congress that the White House should create it, although it would still be run out of the State Department. So that's all very in the weeds kind of stuff. If anybody wants me to talk more about it, I will. But I'm going to leave that aside for the moment, except that the idea of coordinating the federal agencies actually would be a good idea because, and again, this will be another, I know I'm giving you all lots of shocking news that you've probably never heard of before, but the federal agencies actually don't work together terribly well. Shocking, I know, just amazing. And something that would encourage them to work together would be great. There is a problem, though, if you take the State Department and try to put them in charge of other agencies, that doesn't work so well. Because DOD is going to say, why should we listen to the State Department? Or Homeland Security will say, why should we listen to the State Department? So it would have worked better if that had come out of the White House. But it's not been the choice. That was something that got changed that we couldn't, nothing could be done about that. Now, the other piece, which is more relevant to what we're talking about, is it would impose import restrictions on cultural materials illegally removed from Iraq after March of 2011, the beginning of the revolt. To give the background to that, in 2003, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on all countries, this was after the looting of the museum in Baghdad, to restrict the import, to prevent the import of cultural materials illegally removed from Iraq. And the US and all the Western countries and the European Union and Russia and a variety of other countries all enacted import restrictions in various ways. The UK actually enacted a criminal provision that applied to Iraqi material. Last February, the UN Security Council passed another resolution similar. It reinforced the earlier one on Iraq and also called for similar trade restrictions for material from Syria. The EU, the UK, Switzerland, as well as a bunch of other countries that already had law in place that would prevent the import of these things into. So they've either took action even before February, or February of last year, 2015, or already had mechanisms in place under the 1970 UNESCO Convention. The US is now the only Western market country that has not done anything to restrict the import of Syrian materials. This legislation would impose those import restrictions, modeled to some extent on the Iraq import restrictions, except that due to a lot of what I will call stakeholder activity, it has some differences. One is that it will sunset at some point in the future. And secondly, it has introduced what's called a safe harbor provision, or a waiver, which is, in a sense, a codification of the first protocol to the Hague Convention, which deals with movable objects. The US has not ratified that first protocol. But this would allow cultural materials coming into the US that are seized at the border, or that I shouldn't, let me back that up. Not materials seized at the border. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Things that an owner in Syria, such as a museum or an institution, wants to deposit in the United States for safekeeping, can do so, can ask that they be brought into the US. The import restrictions would be waived under certain circumstances where the president can certify that the transfer of those objects will not contribute to terrorism funding and the like, or other illegal activity.
Can I be a non-state actor? So if I
Sure.
have a collection of material that I want to deposit,
The legislation is a little unclear because it also refers to custodian as well.
interesting.
The legislation says, so the conditions are that the material, that there is a request to be located in the US, and it must be returned to the owner or lawful custodian upon request.
But who's the lawful custodian? It's not a private collection. It's
Well,
the state
there
property.
also has to be, the president has to certify no credible evidence that granting the waiver will contribute to illegal trafficking in archaeological material, or the financing of criminal or terrorist activities.
So
So
lem-
presumably, if a private collector has something, if they've owned it legally in Syria for the last 50 years,
No, no,
They do this, but they don't ask about there's
Provenance.
No, legal private ownership about it.
then it would not be allowed, because the president has to certify proactively that these are not contributing to trafficking.
well, and
So if there are no private collection, because, and by the way, this doesn't,
custody.
wait, let me finish, because this is not just archaeological material. This can include everything up to the present day that we think of as ethnographic material. So people own rugs, people own other things that would qualify for this. It's not just archaeological material. So there is that possibility, but the president has to certify that there's no evidence that this has contributed to illegal trafficking.
But here's the question. Sorry, and I hope I'm
By
not
the
interrupting.
way, I want to say this is the product, not, this is not what some of us might have wanted it to be.
I
This is the
understand.
product of
but
compromise.
I just have a. This is really interesting and I think very topical for me because of right now, for example, we have a collection of material, archaeological material that was essentially rescued by non-state actors, and it's sitting right now distributed between their personal homes, and they want to get it to safety. It's not their personal property. It is looted by looters that they were able to rescue. They are trying to save it from being used to provide trafficking or whatever, but this is not a private or personal collection that they can show paperwork to.
So that would be arguably stopped and would not be subject to the waiver.
Would this cover it?
Well,
Because
first of all,
as
it's
I
going
read
to
it,
be
I'm not sure.
implemented by the State Department.
So how is it going to be?
And, you know, there's some things we don't know the answer to. But I can't predict. There is, you know, in theory, it's the president who grants the waiver. The president's a busy person. He's probably not going to be doing this personally. He will delegate it down, and my guess is because of the structure of the way this works, it will end up in the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, but in their legal department. And they will, clearly, somebody who shows up at the border with it, who can't show where it came from, would not be granted the waiver.
Well, you have to show it here at the border?
Or if it's, I'm saying if somebody showed it at the border, it would not be granted the waiver.
Right.
It is intended for people or institutions with collections that want to deposit it themselves for safekeeping.
So it's institutions for institutions.
It doesn't have to be, it doesn't say institution. It has to be the lawful, the language has changed many times. It's got to be the owner or lawful custodian.
Right, which means the state, the Syrian state can then deliver it.
So like in Syrian antiquity, anything older than 100 years old by definition, like from the beginning of the 20th century, is considered heritage material that is owned by the state, right? So anything is not declared is considered illegal. That's one thing. The other thing, there is a legal, what do you call it, lawful
Possession, right.
Possession. So that's the big book, for example, in Aleppo. It's like a Swiss family of origin or something, a Libyan family, basically, who own the collection. That collection is considered to be owned by the state, but they were the local custodians. And they managed to get that out to Lebanon and then to France because they were they had a legal framework for that. There are lots of, like say, in the houses, like in the region where I come from, the Hawra, like you have like a column capital in a house. They are considered the local custodians, so that's fine, but they cannot, in that though, they could probably do something about it, right? So this is like a lot of things fall within 100 years framework. Anything is, older than 1900 is considered illegal to own or possess.
Okay, but you said there are some circumstances where people are the lawful custodian.
Right, yeah.
It's very, very
Possess-
rare. It's extremely
It's
rare.
very rare. It's very few, and then
Well-
they have to have the connect. Like I don't know well. Like this
Antaki.
Yeah.
George
so,
Antaki,
I mean,
who's-
some very
Right.
well-established, well-known people with connections to the government.
Right. I mean, the problem is between the easy case, which may or may not ever happen. Let's say the DGAM comes to the United States and says, we want you to take the collection of the Damascus, the National Museum in Damascus for safekeeping. I mean, that's the easy
Yeah,
example.
that's the state for the state.
And, I think that is the primary paradigm type of thing. Then you have the other extreme. Somebody just says, here, I have it. Allow it in. No evidence of where it came from. That is not going to be allowed, I would assume. In between, there's a whole variety of possible things that you can't write into legislation what every possible scenario is going to be. And I think the intent was to make this exception about as narrow as possible,
Right.
to avoid the risk of people who are trafficking in somewhere along the line. And I just want to refer quickly to, interestingly, based on the waiver in the legislation, and I should say the first protocol that it was modeled on is only state to state, really, because only states are party to international instruments. The AAMD, which is the Association of Art Museum Directors, that represents the largest art collecting museums in the United States, actually in North America, so including Mexico and Canada, then developed their protocol for safe haven. And interestingly, they used the word depositor. They listed museums in the affected area, governmental entities, U.S. government authorities who have seized works on entry to the United States, and private individuals, companies, or organizations who own or come into possession of works. So they have taken, interestingly, the legislation, which was written to be pretty narrow as to who could bring materials, material could come in. They have, now, obviously they can't violate the law, or we hope we assume they don't intend to violate the law, but they have taken the legislation on this issue and broadened it really significantly so that it could in fact include traffickers. And I think that as an example of where that segment of the museum community is going is really problematic. I mean, they want this to be much broader than the legislation was actually written to be.
Well, and so their protocol, the AAMD, the U.S. Association of Art Museum Directors, they've created a registry online, and they have raised the issue of a safe haven for objects at risk. And so why don't I broaden that question out of a safe haven and evacuation to get a little input on, for the works at risk on the ground in the Middle East and Northern Africa, because this is a broader subject, but also focused on Syria, whatever you might have some personal input on. Are works being evacuated effectively, both from museums, from archaeological sites, obviously non-movable objects, there's nothing you can do, and to what extent are museums outside of Syria playing any role in providing some sort of safe haven for works like that? Any of you speak to that?
I defer to you.
All right. Look, I'm not an expert on a lot of this stuff, but I can tell you from what I do know that the issue of safe haven is a prickly subject, to say the least, and it's on past performance. It's not been a happy one for both donor and recipient, or safe haven and source. Simple example, what happens if, let's say, the conflict in Syria is somehow resolved but not to our liking, and we have a stash of material from Syria that is, let's say, stored here, but we don't like the regime in Syria that is in charge, and we consider it a pariah. Yet it's there, it's established, it's the state, it holds the seat at the United Nations, but we're just not friendly with it. Do we give the stuff back to them? Do we not give it back? The legal ramifications of that are endless, and I think there are plenty of nightmare stories that are out there. So really the issue of safe havens is a problematic one. In terms of Syria itself, we know that Mahmoud Abdul Karim and the DGAM did do a remarkable job in trying to evacuate as many of their museums as they could from the areas that are most affected into the areas that are least affected. I'm not saying it's 100% safe or secure. And in that, I also have to sort of add that, also remember that Mahmoud Abdul Karim and the DGM are not, at the end of the day, powers that control the destiny of these pieces. There are higher powers. At any moment, the state, the regime could come and say, well, I'm taking these and I want to do something else with them, and Mahmoud would not be able to stop them. All he might have done is just collect everything for them in one place so that they can use it for something else. So, but that said, there have been, they've done a lot of work in terms of trying to get the most important, let's say the crown jewels, out of harm's way as much as possible.
What about for archaeological sites? Has there been any effort to?
Well, what can you evacuate? I mean, the archaeological site is. You mean any objects in the archaeological site?
Right, to inventory, document, and actually remove some of these materials?
Look, in Syria, and Salam can also sort of back this up, I mean, by law, no excavation is allowed to leave any material it excavated that season that is of object quality or museum quality in the in the dig house or in the location of the site. It must be transferred by the end of the season and submitted or handed over to the nearest local museum. Now, occasionally, you know, sites will hold on to stuff for 1 or 2 seasons, just under the sort of umbrella, oh, we're photographing them, we're recording. But by and large, I think at the time of the outbreak of the conflict, no site I can think of had anything of real, you know, museum quality value, saleable value at the dig houses. The dig houses would have been filled with pottery shards, and you know, that is used for counting or just that kind of stuff. So there is nothing of commercial value, let me put it this way, in the dig storerooms beyond the computers and the tables and the chairs and the. I think when they broke into they sold the crates, the boxes, the plastic boxes. That was the only thing of value in Raqqa. They threw the sherds and the stuff on the floor, and they took the plastic sort of boxes and they sold them. Yeah, they were more valuable than the content. So
that's not your opinion, though, right?
Huh?
That's not your opinion. I mean, they're scientifically valuable.
It's just
Yes, yeah, no, of course, no, of course, no. Scientifically, they're the most important thing. I'm talking about in terms of as a looter,
Okay.
from a looter's perspective. God.
Okay, so we've talked about very.
This is on camera.
That's why you should clarify.
Now, thank you for helping me out here. I owe you a pint.
So we've talked about various motives for looting: economic, international attention, ideology. So these varying motives and the various actors, how do you see if they? Do you think that different approaches for undermining looting would be in order? And can you kind of address that a little bit, depending on the various actors? And we haven't really talked that much about where the looting is coming from with any specificity. And maybe talk a little bit about Russia's role in the with the bombing and.
Wow, anything else?
Oh, okay.
Just,
well,
okay.
let's focus
I'll hit a few points sort of as I go
on the
along.
motives and maybe a different approach based on the actors.
Right. I'll start with the end with the Russian one because that's the easiest one to deal. I mean, from the Russian perspective, they're not really that worried about sort of cultural heritage or sites or anything. They see military targets, they bomb them indiscriminately. In the I think it was the 22nd to the 25th of February, the Russians bombed the site of Ebla twice. We just submitted the report. You guys have it. You know, they hit the site several times. There are 10 new craters on the site. Before that, they bombed Shinshara in the Dead Cities, and you know, they regularly bomb archaeological sites. And 2 days ago, they bombed Qalat, the fortress of Fakhreddin in Palmyra. Yeah, I saw the pictures yesterday. Now they're on Facebook. So the Russians regularly, they have no. And by the way, the Russians are not unique. Do you all remember Kobani? Yes, and how when the coalition airstrikes started to hit sort of in, and everybody was cheering and clapping, and CNN was showing these beautiful, and the one particular hill that ISIS had taken that literally overlooked the site and raised their flag, and then for the next 48 hours we pounded the hill to dust and destroyed the ISIS flag that had been planted. It was called the Mistur. Do you remember all that? That's an archaeological tell we just bombed. And I called a friend of mine and said, stop talking about it. That's terrible. You just bombed the living daylights out of an archaeological tell. You know? So we do that as well. We're not, you know, it's and I think under international law there are.
Well, this is military necessity.
Yeah, there are rules. There are ways of kind of covering that up. In terms of motive and what we're doing, and I started to talk about ISIS, and I explained, ISIS sort of, for example, really sees, first of all, looting, everybody's looting. And in fact, by the way, looting of antiquities is a time-honored tradition. Every Syrian lives either on top of an archaeological site, within a stone's throw of an archaeological site, or, you know, next door to an archaeological site. And everybody knows where the stuff is, and from time to time we hear, oh, you shouldn't mention the name of, where the sites are. You're telling the bad guys where to go looting. Everybody knows where it is. It's you live in a village in Syria, you can see it all over. You live in a city like Aleppo, you just literally scratch the ground within a few centimeters. It's coming out of the, it's everywhere. So, when people run into trouble, historically speaking, they will, try to find bits and baubles. There's this urban myth in Syria that everybody knows somebody whose second cousin, third removed, was digging for a well, and they came up with a pot of gold, and everybody dreams about the pot of gold they're going to find, and they're going to become rich. It's part of our. It's part of our culture, maybe. I mean, now we hope that, and we assume that sort of as we educate people, as we sort of become a modern state, as we sort of enter the 21st century, we kind of overcome these kinds of issues. But in times of war, in times of conflict, in times of hardship, in times of vacuum, people are going to revert back to some of these activities. Some of it is being carried out by what we call subsistence looting, a lot of local people who've lost their livelihoods. They're just trying to eke a living. I've met looters in Turkey. I've sat down with them. I've spoken to them. They are, very sad people in some cases who are literally just trying to feed their families. In some other cases, they're professionals. They've been doing it for a long time. They've been doing it long before the start of the conflict. And this is their living. There are whole villages, I think, that just specialize in either looting or some sort of smuggling or some sort of activity like that in border areas. So you have the whole spectrum. The thing with ISIS, as I mentioned, is that it takes this situation and it institutionalizes it. It makes it part of the state source of revenue raising. It intensifies it. It brings in a sort of order, a sort of structure to it, where there are rules on how you do it. So like that hoard that I showed you from Meskene with all those very nice Middle Bronze axes, and basically the guy was given a license to excavate. They gave him some machinery. They gave him the fuel to run the diggers, and in return he was told he was allowed to keep a certain percentage of the profit, and he was also given, I can't remember now, I think it was 6 weeks to find a buyer. And if he failed to find a buyer, it was going to be taken back to the head office in Manbij, and then from there it ended up in the Raqqa auction and got sold in Raqqa. All right, so there's an order, there's a structure, there's a system to this, and it's very well organized, and and it's very destructive, because when you're using this kind of machinery and this kind of equipment, you cause a lot of damage. And it's different, again, from the kind of damage that we've seen with regards to intentional destruction. That's for propaganda purposes, where they go in and they blow up the Temple of Bel, or they blow up the Nimrud, or they destroy the contents of the museum in Mosul. But I did also point out to one last type of destruction, which is the religious. Right. And that is really different. I think it's important for us to kind of pause here and just let me explain it. You see, from a religious angle, ISIS, remember, they have a very strict Salafist approach to religion and Islam, and but they also know that no Muslim or otherwise, or even Christian, is going to walk into a museum and kneel before the statue of a god or a deity or some person and start praying. They know that. They're not stupid. They understand that. So the destruction of those statues and those images is not really for fulfillment of a supposed religious belief or requirement. However, when it comes to shrines and places of worship, especially for other Islamic sects they consider to be heretical, like Shiites, like Druze, like Alawites, then it's totally different. Even Sunnis, who perhaps, like the Tomb of Jonah, which was basically a place that was also considered important for Sunnis, that for a very extreme narrow Salafist Wahhabi interpretation like that of ISIS, that is totally different, because that is considered to be a pollution of the pure Islam that they are trying to recreate. To them, this goes back to the issue, the concept of essentialism. They believe that Islam has an essence, a pure essence, that goes back to the time of the Prophet and the rightly guided caliphs. And they are trying to reenact that. They're trying to bring that back. It's like a diamond that has an essence, a pure light that shines through, and somehow over time it's become dulled by these impurities, by these extra inclusions, by maybe a schismatic sect emerging here or a practice emerging there. And Wahhabism emerged back in the 18th century as a means of purifying Islam, as a revivalist movement to cleanse Islam so that Islam could then rediscover its pure origins and this essence could come back out again. And ISIS is functioning off that ideology, of that process. So to them, destroying the tomb of Jonah, destroying a Shiite shrine, is in essence purifying Islam to bring out the pure essence back out again, and only then will Islam and the right, correct Islam will then prevail. So, and that is different, very different from when ISIS blows up at the Temple of Bel or destroys the contents of the museum in Palmyra. And this is not often noticed out there, and it's, I think, very important to reinforce that and to demonstrate that clear difference.
In terms of documenting who's taking action, because you have so many different players, maybe Drs. Wolfenbarger and Panaccio can address to what extent with the monitoring of damage. I mean, you can see what's on the ground after the damage has taken place, but can you, in terms of evidence, are you able to ascertain who is taking action? And I don't know whether drones play a role in this and what the various forces are that create the damage. To what extent do the various approaches you take address that and result in evidence that can be used later?
So in some cases with the monitoring damage and identification, it's very obvious. Less so now, I guess, now that there's a number of people bombing in Syria. Earlier on, I mean, you saw a bomb crater, you knew it was the regime because no one else had that capability. So that is one of the more obvious ways that we've been able to identify that type of damage. A lot of it is about bringing together multiple different sources. And Susan also mentioned that, you know, we're not just looking at a satellite image on its own. We're, you know, looking at news reports, we're looking at social media reports, where we have people that are on the ground that are sending us information that helps us to be able to understand what's going on the ground, because, you know, they don't have, you know, I belong to so-and-so painted on the top of their tanks and things like that. And
there's not live monitoring. It's an aggregation of all sorts of pieces.
There is. We do provide. I mean, we have. I mean, my group basically we have site monitors. They're distributed in different areas, all outside regime control. We have some even in ISIS-held territory, and we provide regular. I mean, literally, as we were sitting here, I think I got 7 updates, live updates on what's going on the ground. Anything ranging from there's an auction about to be held tomorrow at such and such a place to these 2 pieces just are being offered by so-and-so to so-and-so to this site just got struck to yesterday I received I think 2 reports from the Idlib province on sites. You know, this is constant. It's almost, I don't want to say daily, I would say weekly reporting. And if there's something time sensitive or immediate, it comes right in, and then we disseminate it right out again.
And there's some activities that are much easier to monitor. So things like bombing, where you can kind of track who is in the area, or with airstrikes, you know who has planes and who doesn't have planes. Obviously, something like the Aleppo Citadel is more difficult because it's now basically caught in the middle of these 2 factions going back and forth. Something like looting is a lot more difficult to attribute to any one particular group. especially considering if you kind of get these reports on and off, and when we hear about these things, sometimes the satellite imagery isn't specific enough to give us a particularly great time range, and so it can be hard to then say we can directly attribute it to this group. For some of these sites that are like the smaller ones, some of the bigger ones is easier because you know who was holding it. But
one of the interesting things that we've done, and that we use this a lot in Ukraine, so with the satellite imagery that we both use, it's from Digital Globe, which is the biggest U.S. provider, and we both have access to that imagery from the U.S. State Department. Digital Globe, their biggest customer is the U.S. government, and the U.S. government tasks these satellites a lot. And so one of the things that we've found, and it's kind of a fun byproduct, not fun, but a fun byproduct, I would say, of that, is that we will often just go into the archives. You can look at the archives online of what's been collected, and we literally look around and see where a lot of images have been collected. And then we get those images because clearly someone thought they were important, and a lot of times it's the U.S. government, and that points us to locations where maybe we wouldn't have looked otherwise. But, because these archives become quasi-public, we're able to, sleuth our way into learning about sites that maybe we wouldn't have known about otherwise.
Right. So one of the issues that Professor Alesi mentioned was the marketplace and provenance and market practices in terms of the histories of objects is obviously a very important topic. I know that the International Council of Museums have created a red list. We are grappling right now, as Professor Grossenbluth has addressed, with our own legislation and import issues. And is there anything being done additionally that, normally if someone buys at auction or from a dealer, we have various markers, the 1970 UNESCO Convention, but are there any specific things happening in Syria or that you know of other than the ICOM red list that would help the marketplace in identifying hazardous looted objects with a questionable provenance?
I think before we ask that question, the question should be how much of this is actually making it into the marketplace versus...
Well, and there is some debate about whether looted objects from Syria are actually crossing into the U.S. border. So maybe you could address that.
They may well be. But that's not that's not my point I'm making. It's not whether they're crossing or not. There's a looted material from Syria and Iraq and elsewhere is crossing borders. That we know. But how much of it is actually making it into the market, the actual market? So I'm thinking here, the auction houses, the stores, etc. How much of it is actually surfacing right now? So looted 2 weeks ago, and a month later it shows up at a shop. I think very little, and I think most of us know that. So the market is much more dealer to dealer. So that never goes into the open market. That's very much private, transactions until it reaches probably a dealer with deep enough pockets, who can then put this in his basement or her basement and sit on it for a long, long time, waiting for an appropriate moment to be able to then start to introduce it into maybe a small auction somewhere. And it needs to be laundered, it needs to be cleaned up. It needs to acquire provenance. There's a whole process to this. This is not something straight out of the ground, straight into a shop. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I'm just saying it's much less likely to see in that process. So, and I think, when we start to talk about markets, you have to talk about a much more long-term view of those issues. And I'm no expert on this, by any means. The other thing about sort of the material, the other type of selling, obviously, is where it goes from the ground to a private buyer who has, his own people or dealers who he's a client of, and so these guys will go and they buy directly for their client. And again, it's bypassing the market. And I think sort of when we talk. So we have to kind of take all these issues into account when we talk about market. But one thing I personally would like to see, and I don't know how realistic this is, and maybe I'm just sort of fantasizing here, but what I would like to see is that accountability is not just placed on the seller. So right now there is supposed to be accountability on the seller to make sure that the item they are selling has provenance, theoretically. And I know Patty will be able to say a lot more on this. You know, and I say theoretically, and I say theoretically, and I say, you know, but there is much less accountability, as far as I can tell, on the buyer to make sure that they are also buying something that is, you know, and what are what punishment is there, and which is very sort of
Well,
yeah,
and the buyer needs a way to conduct their due diligence
what I
in
would
the
like to see
marketplace.
is people prosecuted, both buyer and seller, and I say I dream, I fantasize, prosecuted under terrorism, because you know if we can slap, if you really, you know, you want to put the fear of God in these people. That it's not just they're going to get their pieces confiscated, so they sell 20 pieces and the 21st one gets confiscated, so they're still making a profit and everything's okay. I want to put the fear of God in them. You get caught with one piece that is illegal, you're going to be charged with terrorism, you're going to lose everything you own, everything you've owned in the past, and everything you will own in the future. You're going to go to jail for a very long time. That will put the fear of God. I dream.
Well, let me jump in, as you can tell. So first of all, picking up on a couple of your points, the market is less transparent today than it was 20 or 25 years ago. Before law enforcement, it's been one of the unintended consequences of prosecutions or other law enforcement actions. So today, if you go on a dealer's website, the chances are you're not going to see a whole lot just out there, because they know that all sorts of people are looking. And auction houses, and this is not just with antiquities by any means, but a substantial portion, it's not 100% sure how much, of auction house business is now private sales. And if you are trying to decide how you're going to sell something, and you think it might have a dodgy provenance, of course you're going to choose to sell it privately. And that also, there's, in addition to everything you've said, I don't think you mentioned the warehousing, that things can be warehoused in the Middle East.
I did.
You did mention it, okay.
So
Moving
deep
on.
pockets warehousing.
Right, okay. So it doesn't have to sell from a dealer to a dealer, a dealer to a private person. It can just be being warehoused fairly early on, perhaps, in the process. And we saw that from what we've seen of material that was looted out of Iraq. And it can take years. We also shouldn't ignore the bottom end of the market. If you go on eBay, you will find antiquities. Now, a lot of that is probably fake, but you will find less valuable things whose provenance you can never tell. Now, that gets to sort of your question. Okay, this is my very valuable, authentic, 2000 BC pot from Syria. Whatever you want it to be, but it's valuable, okay? You all with me on that? I can look at, now if I have over here, if I have over there a stash of cocaine, and poor Susan is the owner or the possessor, I can put her in jail in 2 minutes. I don't have to prove almost anything about her, because that is by definition illegal. My pot may or may not be illegal. These things have been traded for centuries, probably 200 years, 150 years. So before the US government can do anything about it, or any other government, they have to prove, first of all, that that actually is a pot that came out of Syria after March of 2011, or whatever date you want to use. That's very difficult.
In most cases, yes.
And, right, unless you have some, you know, real museum quality, unique piece. And I love to use the word relatively unique and near unique, and I know that's an improper use of the term. But still, it has to be truly unique to do that. But secondly, to your point, there has been a shift in government, at least in the United States, law enforcement moved away. Well, they were never big on criminal prosecutions in the first place. But now they're really into what's called civil forfeiture, which is a quasi-criminal activity that may or may not require proof of knowledge on the part of the person who's handling it. What happens with civil forfeiture? The government comes in, they take the object away and give it back, or they hold it, but no personal consequence. And another lawyer in this field, Rick St. Hilaire, has called it catch and release. And it's wonderful. The US government, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, they love it. They get a photo op, they get, some agent gets to take the stuff, I mean, not in the case of Syria, but they get a trip to whatever country to return it, and great ceremony, repatriation ceremonies. Everybody loves it, except it's not effective at all.
Although for buyers, if they're spending a lot of money, they arguably might lose their investment in the object.
That's a relatively small amount of money. And certainly to a dealer, it's just the cost of doing business.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, one of the things, and this goes to Amar's point as well, you have to prove that somebody knew that this piece was illegal. You can't just go putting people in jail.
Why?
Because we have innocent until proven guilty in this country. So criminal punishment requires knowledge or intent. And so not only does the government have to prove that this piece, let's say left Syria after March of 2011, they have to prove that I knew it.
Yeah, but we know that when it comes to terrorism...
And the further down the chain you get, no, it doesn't matter if it's terrorism. I have to know that it's terrorism. I have to know that I'm contributing money to it.
See the flimsy excuses we throw people in jail for terrorism? We just threw a guy, wasn't he here in somewhere in California? The Egyptian, they threw him out of the country.
But my money, when I buy my pot, is not going directly to terrorism. It's going to Susan, it's going to you, it's going to the other Susan, and then eventually down the line it goes back. And as you know, ISIL and the terrorists take their cut at the beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not at the end.
But you're feeding the market. You're feeding demand.
I agree with that, but it's a real challenge. And law enforcement is still at the point, I don't think I need to tell you this,
I know.
where this is still, even with all the links to terrorism, whatever, this is still just not really a high priority. And you're not going to make your career in the Justice Department by prosecuting antiquities theft. You're going to make your career through drugs and through securities violations and other kinds of terrorist prosecutions. It's really difficult. There has been very, very few effective prosecutions that have resulted in jail time over at least, let's say, the last 15 years. I think there are 3.
Shapur, did he end up in jail?
Well, Shapur is in India. He's not being prosecuted in the United States. He's being prosecuted in India. He was in Germany, and the Germans actually extradited him to India, and a bunch of stuff has been picked up, including, we were just talking about yesterday, the day before yesterday, Christie's had 2 pieces. And this is what happens. Law enforcement shows up. They say, in this case to Christie's, oh, those 2 pieces, they came through Kapoor's hands, they're probably, or they are, stolen from India. And Christie says, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Please, take it. And then they say, this is part of our due diligence. This is us cooperating with law enforcement. How wonderful are we?
Having just
and the press and the government eat it up.
Yeah,
and it's not just the press. It's the government eats it up, and they love it. And it is totally ineffective.
I agree.
Well, I want to give the audience a chance to ask a few questions, if there are any, because we're soon to get to the noon hour. Yes, in the back.
The question is to Dr. Al-Azmi. You talked about the day after. We saw these atrocities happening in Afghanistan when they threw the statues of Buddha. Why we didn't take the day before, take some action ahead of time? So we knew these things are going to happen with the Middle East in turmoil, and we didn't do anything, sat on it until things showed in the market or were bought. Another point that I want to mention while I have the time. You mentioned about Wahhabism and resetting it 18th century. What ISIS is doing, resetting it to the beginning of Islam, when most of the people who were people of the area are in small minorities, and they want to erase everything to the beginning of Islam. To erase everything. What is taught in history is a chronological chronicles of the kings, where was born, what he did, what he conquered, all that. But the essence of the history of the place, the importance of the history on itself is not taught in any of those. Then what is the importance of the continuity, not only because of the kings and what they did, what is left behind? That is never taught. So for some who do not know this, oh, this is a good chair from 100 years ago, I could sell it. They don't know the importance of the continuity of the history on the land that they live. Whatever is here is not mine.
Yeah.
I have to destroy it. That's the main thing that's happening.
In terms of why did we not do something about it, I find it very interesting that you bring this up. You know, and this is, I guess, part of our own legacy. Back in 2003, right after the invasion of Iraq and then the looting of the museum, I and Mamoun Abdul Karim and a couple of other people at the DGM were sitting down sort of having a chat, and we looked at each other and we thought, oh my God, what if something like that happens here? What contingency plan do we have for a disaster, even not even an earthquake or a fire or anything like that? And in fact, even before, back in 2000, when not long after I took over, I decided that it was important to begin to, and you know, this is new technology, so then digital cameras were just becoming more available, and you know, I was talking about databases, and I think I was one of the first people who hired or tried to set up in the Department of Antiquities some sort of computer, you know, database program so that we can start to digitally record or transfer some of our manual records into digital records. Manual as in manually recorded. Now, and Salam will testify to this. She worked in the same institution that I did, and she's familiar with some of this stuff. It was very, very slow, and in part, I think, you know, just the work ethic, the work culture, the mentality, all of this sort of fits in. And in part, I think maybe there was in the back of people's minds this could never happen to us. Denial, yeah, this could never happen to us. And Salam was there in the early days, and she could probably tell you much better.
The Iraqi government plan where we put stuff in central banks.
Yeah.
That's what they could do in Iraq.
Yeah. So, you know, so the fact that some people were not thinking about it, that's not true. We were. Myself and others sat down, talked about it into the late night. We even tried to start, you know, some sort of efforts, but I can tell you also that they were very, very slow in enactment, and they were very slow in doing something. Now, later on, you know, once the conflict really kind of started to take over, then efforts sort of, then people really took it seriously. But it was, you know, a year after the conflict that really even the Department of Antiquities itself began to really act in an effective manner, at least a year after the problem started. The day after itself as a name, this was something that we came up with back in 2011 when I started to work with the opposition. We were looking at, you know, the regime was going to fall, and everybody, it was a very crowded arena. Everybody was trying to topple the regime, and I found myself kind of running out of things to do. So I turned around to a friend of mine and I said, look, everybody's working on toppling the regime. Nobody's thinking about what comes afterwards. Let's work on that. And so we started up with this day after, which is the day after Assad falls. What do we do? And we were essentially working on a vision. And we had a series of meetings, and it's a whole different thing, which we then added a cultural heritage component to it back in 2013. We decided we want to also work on that, and so that's why we have the day after cultural heritage, the HPI Heritage Protection Initiative, and that's why it's added. It's part of this. We're looking at how we can help in terms of post-conflict stabilization, you know, reconciliation, just sort of saving this heritage as part of this greater thing, and that's why that's there. In terms of people knowing their history, I think Syrians are aware of their history. They're very aware of it. They learn it at school. They learn it at home. It's around them. The problem is that they're not made stakeholders. We're not stakeholders in our own history. If you went to Syria right up to the beginning of the conflict, basically, any entry port you went into Syria from, you would see a picture of the Assads, and it would say, "Welcome to Surya al-Assad. Welcome to the Syria of the Assads." It belonged to them. And so and the monuments and the cultural heritage was taken over by the Assads and the Ba'ath Party, and it became the super identity. So I was not allowed to have the only way I could identify with my heritage, with my museums, with anything there, is to do it through recognizing the Assads. So people withdraw out of that. They're not made stakeholders. They're not given a role in that. And that is something that we would have to work on. That is something that we would have to, as we try to reconstruct a new Syrian national identity, it's something that Syrians can then rally around. These are some of the issues that we would have to address. And that's a whole different, I think, topic than what we have here.
Very important, though, the identity politics involved.
Any other questions before we break for lunch? Yes.
Actually, might be a completely naive question in a war setting, but so far I've heard all the emphasis placed on how to prosecute people who have committed these crimes. Is there a more carrot approach than stick approach to offer some sort of incentive for local people to help protect, or is there an opposite? There's a professor here I interviewed. He wrote a book called Economic Gangsters, and found that if you gave customs officials something like $1 an hour more, it wasn't worth risking their jobs to smuggle. You know, so thinking about that kind of model, I know in a war situation there probably aren't mechanisms for distributing resources and so forth, but is there any thought going on around that, like incentivizing people not to do it instead of punishing people who have already done it?
Is there any else? I mean, I can talk about on the ground, but is there
I think in the war, it's there are models outside of conflict zones that do that, and the local community, benefits economically from things like tourism and sustainable development of heritage sites. But I'll let you answer.
I think for subsistence looting, yes, there could be a lot to be done, and I think for a lot of people. If they had an alternative, looting archaeological sites and selling this stuff is not this is not a quick way to make money. This is not like this is not like sort of even the ones who do actually find the pot of gold. It's not easy to dispose of that, and they would much rather have a steady job or a steady means of sustaining themselves. Than to go around looting and then trying to sell and dodging. There are always going to be the hardcore looters, the hardcore smugglers, dealers, etc. They're always going to be there. But that would really take it down, I think, a notch. With ISIS, it's a totally different thing because, like I said, it's run by the state. It's institutionalized, and there it's a it's a totally different thing. But I'm thinking of areas outside ISIS control, but also outside regime control. I think there could be a lot more to be done in that area. And we do a lot of work, community work as well. We try, raising awareness, etc. But that can only carry you so far, without the added sort of component that you're sort of introducing here. And I think reducing the level of violence really is the #1 priority. Once you reduce the level of violence, you bring some sort of stabilization, some sort of security, and then gradually things will recede, and then there are new opportunities opening up. I mean, I don't know what else I can say.
Yes, Ben.
I think this question is relevant. I'd be interested to hear from all of our panelists. What are the legal implications for these new movements for crowdsourcing data for satellite data for protecting archaeological sites? We had a recent award from TED for Sarah Parker's work, and in brief, that is a project in which we'll be making global satellite imagery available to the public to be doing this, to be doing the work that some of you are doing. Are there any legal implications there, or any protocol issues that we're learning from these instances that we can apply at more global scale?
Well, I only say I don't think she's crowdsourcing the digital imagery or the she's just going to have people crowdsource what they know within their own community and locality.
Okay.
I think so. I think that's a little bit different, but
Actually, she is planning, she's partnering with Digital Globe to be able to provide more recent satellite imagery that you find on Google Earth, to be able to then have them basically pinpoint not just looting, but possible archaeological sites or random other things.
but that is not going to be publicly crowdsourced. I've talked with her about it.
Oh, okay.
That right, and so
It's limited in some way.
she may be using that to analyze the information that she gets from people. This is my understanding, and this is how she explained it to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that the satellite imagery with all the sites on it, and people are just going to come and
Right.
stick a pin on the donkey or whatever for their local site. But I think the idea is they will feed information to her and her team, and then they will use those resources, but that will be an internal part of the process.
I see.
But it's not really crowdsourcing either, because you and I, and those of us who work on this stuff, know that nobody just sort of picks up the phone and gratis sends you information. It's a much, much more complicated process. And
Well,
yeah.
I'm not completely up to date on exactly what the plan is for that, but I know that in general, thinking about crowdsourcing these types of things, obviously we want to we want to keep the site locations. We don't, you don't want to give people too much context to be able to identify where the site actually is, because we don't want someone to then start volunteering to identify archaeological sites and then conveniently be given, the locations of places where they might want to loot or attack or something.
I disagree. Everybody knows. That is such a myth. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. It sticks out like a sore thumb. Nobody in Syria doesn't know where the archaeological sites are. I'm sorry. That is bogus.
But I think that may be true
Sorry.
for Syria. There are definitely parts of the world
Not-
where I don't think that's true.
Maybe.
I'm not
Not
talking about.
about-
I'm talking about global.
Yeah, we
We're talking globally right
oh,
now.
globally, okay. I don't
Yeah.
know globally. I'm talking
And
about
it's
Syria and
it's
Iraq.
about looking for sites that people don't know about already. So that's a whole different thing altogether. There's always issues around crowdsourcing and satellite imagery in different countries, and nobody really likes having satellite imagery collected and people looking at it of their countries, but it is illegal. They can't stop people from doing it. I think one of the key things that is emerging from crowdsourcing right now, particularly in relation to cultural heritage, is that it shouldn't be open crowdsourcing as you might imagine it. Like if open street maps where anybody can go in and edit features and that kind of thing. For this type of stuff, you want curated crowds that are within a project that have been vetted. People that you trust in some way. You don't want this just to be any random person coming in and volunteering information. So I think in terms of if you do want to do crowdsourcing, there's a space for that for some of the lower levels of does this look like an archaeological site or not? Yes or no, and then feed it to further experts, that type of thing. But not maybe what you're thinking about in terms of some of the other types of crowdsourcing that are out there.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists very much, and I think it's time to break for lunch. Is that right?